two men separated by 4 centuries. One was a French physician who wrote in mysterious 4-line verses that kings feared and scholars still argue about today. The other was a humble Sunday school teacher from Kentucky who fell into deep trances and spoke things he could not possibly know. About medicine, about history, about the future. They never met. They never read each other's words. And yet when researchers began comparing their visions side by side, something deeply unsettling appeared. Not 1, not 2, but 5 specific predictions pointing directly at the year 2026 match, almost word for word. This is not a theory. This is not a coincidence. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand why some of the most serious researchers in the field of prophecy are calling this the most important convergence of visions in recorded history. Stay with this, because what you are about to hear may change the way you see everything happening around you right now. If you want to see all 5 predictions, comment yes below and let's go. But before we go deeper into the 5 predictions, take a quick moment to support the channel. If you find topics like this fascinating, mysterious, and thought-provoking, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who loves exploring hidden history and prophecy, and subscribe to the Interconnected Zone if you have not already. Also consider becoming a member of the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring some of the most intriguing mysteries of our past and future. And as you listen to what you are about to hear, I want you to keep an open mind and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe 2 prophets from different centuries could truly see the same future? Or is there another explanation? I am genuinely curious to hear what you think. Before we get into the 5 predictions, it is important to understand who these 2 men were, because their credibility is what makes this convergence so remarkable. Michel de Nostradamus, known to the world as Nostradamus, lived in 16th century France during a time of plagues, wars, and religious conflict. He was not simply a mystic writing poetry. He was a trained physician who treated victims of the Black Death, a scholar who studied astronomy and classical texts, and a man deeply fascinated by the patterns of history. In 1555, he published a collection of prophecies written in 4-line verses known as quatrains. These verses were deliberately mysterious, filled with symbolism, coded language, and layered meanings. Some say he wrote this way to protect himself from persecution. Others believe he understood that the future could not be described in simple language without changing it. Over the centuries, scholars and historians have linked many of Nostradamus's quatrains to events that occurred long after his death in 1566. Among the most well-known interpretations are references to the Great Fire of London, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and even the devastation of the Second World War. Critics argue that his language is vague enough to be interpreted in many ways. Supporters counter that certain passages are so precise they seem impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The debate has continued for nearly 500 years and shows no sign of stopping. Edgar Cayce lived a very different life in a very different world. Born in 1877 in rural Kentucky, Cayce grew up in a devout Christian family. By all accounts, he was an ordinary man with an extraordinary ability. Beginning in his early 20s, Cayce discovered that when he entered a trance-like state, he could access information he had never studied or consciously learned. While in this state, he answered questions about illnesses, offering detailed diagnoses and remedies for people he had never met. Over time, his readings expanded beyond health to include topics like ancient civilizations, reincarnation, the nature of the soul, and the future of humanity. During his lifetime, Cayce delivered more than 14,000 documented readings. Every one of them was recorded and preserved. Today they are archived by the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, where researchers still study them. Unlike Nostradamus, Cayce spoke in plain language. He did not write cryptic poems. He answered questions directly while in trance, often unaware afterward of what he had said. This difference makes the overlap between the two prophets even more remarkable. One spoke in symbolic riddles during the Renaissance, the other spoke in straightforward language in the 20th century. And yet when their visions are placed side by side, clear patterns begin to appear. Two prophets, 2 centuries, 2 completely different methods of seeing the future, and 5 visions that align in ways many researchers say are impossible to ignore. The first prediction involves what both men described as a great shaking of the earth. But this shaking, according to both prophets, would not only be physical, it would be geological, spiritual, and symbolic, all at once. Edgar Cayce spoke repeatedly about what he called earth changes in readings given during the 1930s and early 1940s. He described a period in the future when the planet would go through dramatic shifts. He spoke about earthquakes occurring in regions that had long been considered stable. He described coastlines changing and land masses rising or sinking. But what made his description different from ordinary disaster predictions was the way he framed these events. Cayce did not describe them as punishments or random catastrophes. He described them as part of a larger process of renewal. In one reading, he said that the Earth itself is alive, and like all living systems, it occasionally goes through periods of adjustment and rebalancing. According to Cayce, these changes would coincide with a shift in human consciousness, almost as if the planet and humanity were evolving together. Now consider what Nostradamus wrote centuries earlier. In one of his quatrains, he described what he called a great movement of the earth, a shaking that would occur during a time when unusual signs appeared in the heavens. He connected this movement not simply to natural forces, but to a moment when the world itself would enter a new phase of history. For centuries, scholars debated what that passage might refer to, but modern researchers studying planetary alignments and astronomical cycles have noted something fascinating. The celestial configurations Nostradamus described appear to closely match astronomical events expected around the mid-2020s, particularly the years leading into 2026. Think about that for a moment. A Renaissance physician writing symbolic poetry and a 20th century trance reader speaking in plain language both described a period when the Earth itself would undergo dramatic changes, and both placed this period within a similar window of time. But here is something even more interesting. Neither man described this shaking as the end of the world. In fact, both seemed to see it as a beginning, a reset, a moment when the planet recalibrates itself for something new. Researchers who have studied Cayce's readings often point out that he spoke of these changes with surprising calmness. He did not emphasize fear. Instead, he spoke about preparation, awareness, and spiritual growth. If Nostradamus and Cayce were both seeing the same period of transformation, then the physical shaking of the earth may only be the outer reflection of something much deeper happening within humanity itself. And this leads directly into the second prediction that both prophets seem to agree on: the collapse of old systems of power. Edgar Cayce spoke about this many times. He described a period when institutions built on greed, control, and exploitation would begin to weaken. He did not say they would collapse overnight. Instead, he described something slower and more complex: a gradual loss of trust, a moment when people begin to question structures they once accepted without hesitation. Cayce described financial systems that would become unstable because they were disconnected from human values. He spoke about governments struggling to maintain authority as populations became more aware and less willing to follow blindly. According to Cayce, these changes would feel chaotic at first, mostly because the systems themselves would resist transformation. But eventually, he believed humanity would begin creating new structures built on cooperation rather than competition. Now consider Nostradamus again. In several quatrains, he wrote about what he called the fall of the great ones. These passages describe powerful institutions losing their influence during a time of global upheaval. In one particularly well-known quatrain, Nostradamus wrote about leaders losing their grip as the foundations beneath them tremble. Scholars have debated for centuries whether he was referring to monarchies, empires, or something else entirely. But when those passages are compared with Cayce's readings, a striking pattern appears. Both prophets seem to describe a time when authority itself begins to shift, not necessarily through violent revolution, but through something quieter and more profound, a loss of belief. History has shown again and again that systems of power depend on trust. When people believe in institutions, those institutions remain strong. But when belief disappears, even the most powerful structures can collapse almost overnight. Look at the world today. Political divisions, economic uncertainty, growing distrust in institutions, and a global conversation about the future of leadership. Whether you view these developments as progress or instability, they echo exactly the kind of transformation both Nostradamus and Cayce described. And this raises a question worth considering. Are we witnessing the early stages of the transition they both saw? Because if their visions continue to align, the next prediction may be the most personal of all. Both prophets described a moment in history when large numbers of people would begin experiencing a deep shift in awareness, not a traditional religious revival, not the rise of a single belief system, something deeper and more individual, something that could only be described as a spiritual awakening. But what exactly did they mean by that, and why did both of them connect this awakening to the chaos and confusion of the same period of history? That is where the story becomes even more fascinating. When both Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce spoke about a coming awakening, they were not describing the rise of a new religion or the dominance of an old one. In fact, the way they described this transformation suggests something far more personal and far more universal at the same time. Edgar Cayce referred to it as the awakening of what he called the Christ consciousness within, meant that individuals would begin developing a deeper awareness of compassion, responsibility, and connection to one another. In several readings, Cayce explained that this awakening would occur gradually, almost invisibly at first. People would begin questioning ideas they had inherited without reflection. They would search for deeper meaning in their lives. They would begin recognizing that the well-being of one human being is inseparable from the well-being of another. According to Cayce, this awakening would not happen because the world was becoming more peaceful. It would happen because the world was becoming more uncertain. Crisis, he suggested, has a way of forcing humanity to look inward. Now consider how Nostradamus described a similar moment. Writing in the language and symbolism of the 16th century, he spoke of a new light entering the minds of men. This light, he suggested, would reveal truths that had long been hidden beneath the noise of politics, power, and conflict. Nostradamus described people beginning to see through illusions that once seemed unquestionable. He spoke about confusion spreading across the world, but within that confusion he hinted that many would discover a deeper clarity. The fascinating part is that both prophets seem to connect awakening with disruption. They did not suggest that humanity becomes wiser when everything is comfortable. Instead, they implied that transformation often begins when familiar structures break down. If you think about human history, this pattern appears again and again. Periods of crisis often lead to bursts of creativity, innovation, and spiritual reflection. When the old ways stop working, people begin searching for new understanding. And this may be exactly what both Nostradamus and Cayce were pointing toward. Over the last few decades, we have seen an explosion of interest in personal growth, consciousness, meditation, energy healing, and spiritual exploration outside traditional institutions. Millions of people are asking questions that previous generations rarely considered. Questions about purpose, about the nature of consciousness, about whether reality itself might be far more interconnected than we once believed. Is this the awakening both men were describing? That is a question each person must answer for themselves. But the similarities in their visions are difficult to ignore. And this leads us to the fourth prediction, one that has captured the attention of serious researchers studying prophetic traditions. Both Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce spoke about the emergence of voices during this period of transformation, voices that would carry a message humanity desperately needed to hear. But what makes their descriptions unusual is what they did not say. Neither prophet predicted the arrival of a single, powerful savior figure dominating the world stage. Instead, they described something more subtle and perhaps more powerful. Edgar Cayce spoke about teachers who would appear not through institutions but through personal experience and spiritual insight. He described individuals who would speak with authenticity rather than authority. In one of his readings, Cayce said there would come those who teach because they have lived the truth they share, not because they have inherited a title or position. Nostradamus described a similar idea, though in the poetic language of his time. In one quatrain, he suggested that during a period of confusion, the voice of the humble would rise above the voice of the proud. In another passage, he hinted that the messengers of transformation would not come from the centers of power, but from unexpected places. This idea may have seemed strange centuries ago. In Nostradamus's time, information traveled slowly, and authority was tightly controlled by institutions. But look at the world today. For the first time in human history, individuals can reach millions of people with a message, an idea, or a perspective without needing permission from traditional gatekeepers. Independent thinkers, spiritual teachers, researchers, and storytellers now share ideas across the globe instantly. Some researchers studying Cayce's readings believe he was describing the rise of decentralized wisdom, a world where knowledge spreads through networks rather than hierarchies. And when you consider platforms where people gather to explore deeper ideas, to question old narratives, and to share perspectives that challenge conventional thinking, you begin to see how such a vision might unfold. Perhaps the voices both prophets saw were not meant to come from a single stage. Maybe they were meant to rise everywhere, through conversations, through communities, through channels where people gather to explore the mysteries of history, consciousness, and the future of humanity. And if that is the case, then something very interesting is happening right now. Because every time people gather to discuss these ideas, every time someone questions what they were told to believe, every time a person searches for deeper understanding, the very process both prophets described begins to unfold. But the final convergence between Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce may be the most powerful and hopeful part of their visions. Because after the upheaval, after the shaking of the earth, after the collapse of old systems, and the awakening of human awareness, both prophets described something extraordinary. They described a period of peace, not a perfect world, not a place where conflict disappears overnight, but a genuine shift in the direction of human civilization. Edgar Cayce referred to this future as a new order of the ages. In his readings, he spoke about a time when humanity would begin building societies around cooperation rather than competition. He suggested that spiritual development would become just as important as technological progress. According to Cayce, the civilizations of the future would recognize that the health of a society depends on the growth of the individuals within it. Nostradamus wrote about something strikingly similar. In one of the more hopeful passages within his writings, he described a long period of peace that would follow what he called the Great Confusion, a time when nations would begin working together in ways that had previously seemed impossible. What makes these predictions remarkable is not just that both men described peace. It is that both of them believed peace would come after a period of difficulty. In other words, they seemed to believe that humanity would have to learn something before reaching that stage. Perhaps the lesson is cooperation, perhaps it is responsibility, or maybe it is the simple realization that the divisions humanity has fought over for centuries were never as real as they seemed. Both Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce appeared to see history as a cycle, periods of challenge followed by periods of growth. And if their interpretations are correct, then the difficult years humanity experiences are not meaningless chaos. They are turning points, moments when choices matter more than ever. And that brings us to something Edgar Cayce said that is deeply important when discussing prophecy. He insisted that prophecy is not fate. According to Cayce, the future he described was never fixed or predetermined. Instead, it represented possibilities based on the direction humanity was moving at the time. In several readings, he explained that awareness of future possibilities gives people the power to change them. In other words, prophecy is not about predicting doom, it is about offering guidance. Nostradamus seemed to share a similar philosophy. Although many of his quatrains describe turmoil, they also suggest that knowledge itself has great value. Seeing clearly, even when the truth is uncomfortable, gives humanity the opportunity to respond differently. So here we are, two men separated by 4 centuries, two completely different lives, cultures, and methods of prophecy. And yet, when their visions are placed side by side, 5 remarkable parallels emerge. A shaking of the earth, the collapse of old systems of power, a widespread awakening of human consciousness, the rise of new voices carrying messages of unity and truth, and beyond the turbulence, the possibility of a more peaceful era. Whether you believe these parallels represent genuine prophecy or simply fascinating coincidences, they invite an important question. What kind of future are we helping to create right now? Because if both Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce were correct about one thing, it is that the future is shaped not only by events, but by the choices people make during times of uncertainty. And we are living in one of